I want to show you the process of migrating a virtual machine into Azure. I'm going to use one that I've already got that has it's a Linux virtual machine, but the process is really going to be the same whether it's a Linux virtual machine or a Windows virtual machine that you've pulled from your on-premises environment.
I'm going to walk through the process of migrating an on-premises virtual machine into the Azure environment. Now, the entire process takes generally well over an hour, and I don't think that would make for a very good demonstration. So this is going to be what I would call a cooking show demonstration. Have you ever watched a cooking show? Yeah, they put all the ingredients together, they stick it in the oven and pull it right back out, and it's all immediately done. And that's kind of what we're doing here, because honestly, I've already gone through the process. Okay, but we're going to show you the parts. There's basically three parts to this process. The first part is getting the local virtual machine ready. So you've got your customized virtual machine, you've got your application installed on it, the OS configured, whether it's Windows or Linux, it's all set up. All right, you have to go through a preparation process. And on the Windows side, I've got, by the way, a Windows 10 virtual machine here that I'm going to migrate, well, that I've already migrated, but conceptually that I'm going to migrate. So what I need to do is I need to get the virtual machine image ready for the process. And to do that, I run sysprep. Okay, and I've got an elevated command line here. It's running as administrator. And so I just go and run sysprep from Windows System 32 sysprep. And it's going to come up with this interface. And I want to enter system out of the box experience. And when it's done, I want to shut down. And I would hit OK, and it'd be good to go. But I'm going to cancel that. Yeah, but that's the first process. Now, once you have that, the next process is to get the VHD from your on-premises location into the Azure environment. And I've got that process here with the upload VHD. All right, the first thing you would do is you would log into your account. Then, you actually don't need to do these bits. Always do that, and I don't need to. Those two lines are not necessary. Line 4 is setting up the VHD URL. That's where you're going to upload the VHD to. I've got a storage account. We'll talk about storage accounts later. But NCG demos is a storage account, and then VHDS is a container, and then win10ltsb.vhd, which is a terrible name for it, but that's fine. That's the actual source image name, and it's coming from a local file, and that's that file there. And then all I need to do is call the add Azure RM VHD, specify the resource group that I want it in, where it's going, and where it's coming from. Great, that's pretty simple. That's going to take a long time because you're uploading gigabytes of data. Now, once that's done, and it's really not that exciting, watch it flash through, but that would take an hour, so we're not going to do that. But at that point, you have a virtual hard drive up in the Azure environment. Now, the fun part is creating a virtual machine from this. Now, this was actually, honestly, a little bit easier in version 1. I could do the whole thing through the portal, through the classic portal. In version 2, you actually have to do this through PowerShell, but that's okay. We're developers. We can definitely deal with that, and we could script it out and make it rerunnable. All right, so here's the process. First of all, I've got a series of variables that are, various things. First is going to be the URL of the source image file. So that's that VHD file that I uploaded. That'll be the source that I will create my virtual machine based on. Then I get the virtual network that I want to associate it with, and I get a subnet from that virtual network. And so I just get the default subnet of a virtual network that exists. So I have a virtual network, 20532v2, and then I get the first subnet of that. On line 4, I am creating an Azure public IP address. All right, and that is an ARM element, a resource that provides public access. And then in the next line, line 5, I am creating a network interface. And the network interface is going to use the public IP address. And there's a number of settings for both of those. And it's going to associate with the subnet that I've got. So I've got a network interface card that's associated with a public IP address, and it's associated with a virtual network and a subnet. The next thing I do is I get a set of credentials that are going to be used to define the login to the virtual machine. And if you've ever seen this, I'll just run that one real quick, very quickly. So it just allows you to put in a username and password. And so then that's a secure credential. Then I get my storage account. And then the next 3 lines, actually really 4 out of the next 5 lines, are setting up a configuration object for the virtual machine. And this is a fairly common pattern actually across many things you do with Microsoft, particularly if they're remote, as is this, and that you set up a configuration object and you really do all of your tweaking of the configuration object, and then you use that configuration object to actually create the object. Okay, so it's almost, a lot of times you think, okay, I'm going to create the object and then I'll configure it. Here, it's really the opposite. You create the configuration object and again, use that. All right, so the first thing I do is I create a new configuration object with line 8 right there. And I give it a name and I give it a VM size. So it's going to be a standard A1 virtual machine. Then I set operating system settings on line 9. Now the way this works is kind of interesting. Each one of these after the new Azure RM VM config takes a VM config parameter. And this is designed so that you can actually pipe this process if you wanted to, but I think it's a little easier to read if it's not piped. And so I'm just setting this up as a Windows operating system. I give it a computer name and I give it the credentials that I stored. Then in line 10, I add a network interface to that configuration. And then 11 and 12, I'm actually setting up an OS disk, which I didn't really give it a very good OS disk name, but that's okay. And I add the OS disk, and there's a couple things that are really important with that. One, all right, I give the name, the VHD URI, that's OS disk. Source image, that's the actual source up here that I had uploaded in this step previously. And it's Windows, and I'm creating it from the image. Okay, the next thing is almost anticlimactic. I go ahead and create the virtual machine, and all of that configuration is in that config variable, and so it's used to define the virtual machine. The last step, once the virtual machine goes through, and there's really not much to these processes, it just sort of run through, then I would run and get the public IP address. And so there's my public IP address. And once it's all created, go to my remote desktop connection, which pop down below. Oh, that is one big remote desktop connection screen. And connect. And it's going to ask me for the password for the credentials that I set up. And I'm going to take this to my other desktop. Say yes to that. And then, and again, the resolution being a bit suspect right at the moment. But you can see down here that I do have a really big virtual machine. Well, I'm not going to worry about actually setting this up because you've seen enough of this to see that I am connected, even though it looked a little bit horrible. But I was able to configure my VHD, configure the image locally, and then transfer that image up to the Azure environment. And then within Azure, create a new virtual machine based on the image. Now, the very cool thing with that is if, let's say I was doing this as part of an ongoing development process, I have the image up there now. I could, whenever I wanted to, create a new virtual machine based on that image.
Keep in mind, the process, once you have the right VHD, is pretty straightforward. What is a bit more challenging, of course, is making sure that the VHD is properly configured to work in the Azure environment. And also consider, do I really need to migrate the entire VHD, or is this something where maybe I can just, create a new virtual machine in Azure and then load my application onto that virtual machine?